Welcome to episode number 83, where sticks and stones become beams and boulders. I am your host, Damon Soka. First of all, today, if you've enjoyed these episodes, pass them along to someone else, a friend or a family member, even if they don't have issues with mental illness. Knowledge is really a powerful force. Now, today we'll be addressing issues with anxiety disorder and depression with anxiety. Now, the definition of this disorder is a little vague, but it's going to be very important to our discussion today, and really important to understand. Now, people with generalized anxiety disorder display excessive anxiety or worry most days for at least 6 months about a number of things, such as personal health, work, social interactions, and everyday routine life circumstances. The fear and anxiety can and does cause significant problems in areas of their life, such as social interactions, school, and work. Most of you who have listened to my podcast for any length of time know that I really don't like statistics because they're impersonal and, for the lack of a better word, cold. They don't allow anyone to really see the truth and struggle behind the illness. Now, to say that 18% of the population of the United States has anxiety-related mental illness doesn't really help anyone except maybe those who need the research money. And to say that more than half of those individuals with depression are also diagnosed with anxiety disorder doesn't really provide any true understanding of the illness. Now, while those statistics are true, and they each represent a person who is fighting this mind-bending, reality-altering illness that changes even the smallest details in their lives. Those statistics also represent people who look normal on the outside, but are far from normal on the inside. And that is really the insidiousness of the disease, or the illness. We look, talk, and for the most part, act normally, but we are far from normal on the inside. We live almost as two people, just to survive an archaic world. There probably isn't anyone listening who hasn't heard the familiar saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." It is a familiar saying that in some feeble way attempts to clarify that what somebody says about you really doesn't or shouldn't matter to you. Now, the concept is true enough. Certainly it doesn't matter what someone's opinion of you is. But what that saying does assume is that you have a sufficient self-esteem and a solid psychological and spiritual foundation to implement the words "will never hurt me" part of the saying. And what this also assumes is that you do not have an illness that seeds, waters, and grows serious insecurities and doubts in your mind, like anxiety and depression often do. Now, anxiety and depression not only grow and harvest serious doubts, but they can also amplify the harsh words that never hurt. Minute and seemingly small words and actions that had no negative intent to the sufferer of anxiety and depression can be boulders and beams to an already despondent and broken heart and mind. The sufferer does not hear things as would a normal person. Those who suffer with anxiety and depression are quick to disregard the positive and accentuate and magnify the negative, even when that negative was never intended to be disparaging. Thus, my title today, where those sticks and stones actually become beams and boulders. Now, anyone who's ever suffered with anxiety or anxiety with depression understands that anxiety can magnify words and actions of another person beyond what was ever intended. The magnification in the mind is not intentional or deliberate in that the sufferer specifically and consciously looks for the negative. Anxiety, like all other mental illnesses, is a reality-based illness, where our reality is viewed through the magnification of anxiety or depression. Anxiety filters out the positive reinforcement and rational understanding, which means in layman's terms, anxiety produces increased negative emotional states that really ignore rational thoughts and true reality. Anxiety filters cannot be convinced by numbers and facts about remoteness of an event. Anxiety is really an emotional state and a reality to the sufferer, not some rational statistic analysis of the problem. Now, magnifying negative outcomes is only one of the problems with anxiety and depression. Normal individuals are actually able to process the negative and the positive and learn to push out the negative, or at least take it with a grain of salt. Individuals with anxiety cannot filter the negative out. The negative tends to reverberate in the mind and then become amplified, often to points beyond true reality. Now, for instance, let's take a small example of a church member attending a normal sacrament meeting. Just so happens that the stake president is visiting the ward for that Sunday. As the stake president usually does, he passes down the aisle and talks to several people. He just so happens to talk to the person behind and in front of a person who suffers from anxiety. Now, he does wave and smile at the person who is suffering, but to the anxious mind and to the sufferer, the wave and the smile are filtered, and all that is really recorded is that he talked to the person behind and in front. And why didn't he talk to me? Now, most normal people would filter out the discrepancy between a wave and a smile and a short conversation and quickly move on to other things in their lives. However, for the anxiety sufferer, the lack of equal conversation will actually begin to reverberate in the mind and become amplified to really an unhealthy point. I have said before that the mind does not like unknowns, and so someone suffering from anxiety and or depression will quickly begin to drift into negative territory because of those unknowns. Such things as the stake president doesn't care for me. I guess he really doesn't need me. Why are those other people more important than me? Can't he just say one word to me? Maybe he heard about my family and my issues we are having, doesn't want to get involved. Maybe he just doesn't care. Why should I even be here? Now, the questions certainly do not end there, even though I am going to. This one small action by a stake president with no ill intent, in point of fact, the stake president had made an effort with a smile and a wave, may and often does cause the afflicted person to be distracted during the entirety of the meetings and avoid contact with the stake president. For those who might not suffer from serious anxiety, this is going to sound or may sound a little strange. But for those who do, it is actually an everyday occurrence. Small and seemingly insignificant events become mountains of doubt and discouragement. Now, there is no way to extricate the person from the negative spiral that ensues, because it is not rational thinking that got you there. It was a set of feelings about the situation that spurred questions and eventually the reverberating negative spiral. So no amount of rational thought or persuasion is going to extricate someone from the hole that they have dug themselves into. It is common for people who do not suffer to say such things as, why don't you just stop thinking about it? Can't you control yourself and your mind? Now, why are we still talking about this? You are making a mountain out of a molehill. Why can't you just think about something else? However, those sayings only really add to an already miserable state of mind and compound the associated problems with anxiety. Again, the questions are many, but the answer is going to be always the same. The anxious and or depressed brain has altered chemistry that feeds a cycle of thought that falls outside of normal, rational thought patterns. Most people, at least the 80% who do not suffer, have developed methods by which they can regulate fears and concerns. Whether it is ignoring possibilities, downplaying the percentages, or realizing that the odds are most definitely in their favor, or simply facing the fear and overcoming the irrational thought, most people do not analyze a problem only from a negative outcomes position. The world, meaning the society that surrounds each sufferer, creates all types of pressures to force those who suffer to accept the rational boundaries for negative events. They don't understand why a person would continue to think and worry about such negative, remote possibilities. Now, without understanding of the illness, they inadvertently create great strains and stresses upon someone who suffers, and will often cause the person to retract from social interaction. Now, I don't necessarily fault the non-sufferer. I think that it's easy to underestimate the power of anxiety and depression when you've never experienced it, and because anxiety disorders do not change the outward appearance of an individual in any way. Now, because anxiety sufferers desire to be accepted and included, they often hide many of their anxieties, masking them, as it were, to avoid detection. Now, with a lack of understanding in the general population, it is easier to mask our insecurities and the symptoms and the effects of the disease rather than be ridiculed for them. Of course, this only increases the anxiety level and stress on the system. But to be accepted by others and to belong is something inherent in our minds and bodies. So the suffering person is left with two deeply opposed, deeply rooted emotions tearing one another apart at the seams. They desire to belong, but to belong requires facing the unknowns that cause increasingly irrational anxiety problems. Eventually, for most people with moderate to severe anxiety, it becomes far easier to remain isolated from belonging to groups rather than face the onslaught of excessive emotional context required to belong to those groups, or the anxiety, and to maintain relationships within those groups. So what does this really mean in practical terms? The person who suffers with anxiety will tend to remain in safe places where stresses remain low, such as home or other locations where interactions with new people and events are going to be limited. Now, self-isolation is a lonely place, but it can be preferable to high levels of anxiety and emotional distress. What concerns those with anxiety the most are those unknowns. Now, I've explained several times how our brains do not like these unknowns in our life. However, most of us, 80% of us, are able to deal with the unknowns through learned coping mechanisms. Now, for some biological reason, those with anxiety disorder do not possess the same emotional ability to effectively navigate this world of unknowns. Whether by biology, meaning our DNA, or by experience, some significant level of trauma, the brain has become wired differently than a normal person, and what should be a reasonable level of anxiety for unknown possibilities becomes really an out-of-control train, heavily loaded with all kinds of questions with really no answers. So this then leads us to another concern of the overly anxious mind. I've discussed that through small and seemingly insignificant actions, the anxious mind can entirely run out of control. But there are more than just simple actions that cause this runaway train. The anxious person will also focus on negative outcomes that have not occurred and are unlikely to occur. They will focus so intently on statistically remote possibilities that it will actually alter where they go and what they do. Now, for instance, many people are actually afraid of flying, have a fear of flying. But most people work through the issue by taking a Dramamine or alcohol, as they put it, take something to calm their nerves, and then they will face the fear of flying. However, with an anxiety disorder, if flying is one of the problems, then taking a flight is actually not a possibility, even with this medicinal encouragement. For anxious sufferers, the answer to the fear is not a face your fear type of coping mechanism, but an avoidance type of coping mechanism. They are truly unable to use a face your fear type of coping mechanism. Now, airplanes are certainly one thing, and actually many of us can show some empathy, as we have felt a little anxious putting our lives into the hands of someone, first of all, who we do not know. Flying a machine for all intensive purposes does not really look as graceful as a bird. So I certainly understand the mechanics of it, but I am still amazed that a plane leaves the ground. But consider something even as remote as something like a school shooting. I've known teenagers so paralyzed by the fear of a possible shooting that they are unable to attend school. It is not that they have ever experienced a shooting or even known someone involved in one. It is simply the remote possibility of the unknown. It actually paralyzes their ability to act or to go to school. That paralyzing fear is often so great that the mind enters a flight or fight mode and will do almost anything to avoid the possible event. Now, given what I've just said about this paralyzing fear of these paralyzing fears of anxiety, one could imagine that a social church setting, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where requirements for social interaction exist, and not just social interaction, but possible interaction with individuals who might be antagonistic, would actually be very problematic. And perhaps not just be problematic to the anxious mind, but would also induce inactivity and even hostility towards requirements as a member. Now, add to the social aspect a church that requires anxiety-inducing moments such as giving a talk in public, saying a prayer in public, reading in public, teaching a class, being part of a personal interview. And for the anxious person, you have serious grounds for never attending or being involved in any way with individuals of the church. Not because you don't believe it's true or don't have a testimony, but because you have a paralyzing mental illness. Oh, but if you think about it, that's not all. In addition to all of the above requirements that I've just discussed, often local church leaders and sometimes even more regional leaders, of course, with the best intentions, use behavioral obedience and sin as a motivational tool. They discuss the consequences of inaction and not fulfilling requirements and responsibilities of callings, such as ministering, teaching, and the finding of lost sheep. Now, I can tell you from some of my own experience and that of many others that becoming a lost sheep seems like a far better option than trying to find one with anxiety coursing through your veins. Now, I don't fault leadership for their desire to motivate the 80%, and I am sure if they fully understood the situation and the disorder, the words they said would probably be far more different for those who suffer. But as I have stated, those of us who suffer tend to mask and hide our illness, and of course, feel very guilty about it, and guilty about the things we are not doing because of the illness. Now, should we feel guilty? Absolutely not. There is no way that the Lord could require the same level of interaction, social interaction, of the sufferer as he would another who does not suffer. But again, we are dealing with anxiety and emotional overreaching, and so we feel very guilty that we have not done our ministering visits, that we avoid service projects and church social activities, and that we make excuses for talks and teaching. And while we accept callings because we want to belong, we really cannot do them in an effective manner. Thus, we accept our calling and then our guilt. And even some of us accept our fate that telestial life is probably about the best we're going to get based on our level of obedience. Yes, the entire narrative is false, and the Lord fully understands our situation. But even knowing that He does understand doesn't solve our problems or our concerns with our negative, anxious feelings. So we do our best, try to do what we can, really feeling that we have done nothing, and mask and hide until the pressures grow to the point that it is far easier to be a lost sheep than an active grazer with the group. Yes, we have isolated ourselves, but to our defense, it is the lesser of two evils for us based on our anxiety. Better to be isolated and not called to serve than called to serve and feel guilty all the time. Now, before we talk about some helpful solutions to all of this, we're going to come to a final problem that we'll discuss, and perhaps the most complex when it comes to matters of church membership and responsibilities, and that is one-on-one personal relationships. If you remember my example from the first part of this episode regarding the stake president and these greetings and the overanalysis that occurred, it is not difficult to see that building relationships while suffering anxiety is almost impossible. When you overanalyze everything and everyone and do so in a negative light, relationships tend to fall apart or never really get going. People with serious anxiety find it extremely difficult to build even acquaintance-level relationships. To build a lasting, strong relationship with one suffering anxiety and depression takes significantly more time, effort, and for the most part, the person who does not suffer must make a significant effort to be the stable influence in the relationship, providing abundant reassurance, help, love, and forgiveness until the relationship becomes established. I admit it is rare to find such a person who will build a relationship in that way. And so people who suffer with anxiety have small groups of trusted people in their lives, and they tend to not let others into that group. It is not that they don't desire a larger circle of friends. It is simply about the mountainous effort required for them to trust another person. Anxiety-driven people have problems of overanalyzing people whom they have known for many years and where trust has been established. When trust has yet to be developed, it takes more than a few positive experiences for them to trust another person and build a relationship. Often it can take years to build sufficient trust and the relationship. And one small deviation outside of the trust relationship may actually doom that relationship for many years, if not for life, for someone with anxiety. Most people will not invest that level of effort for a relationship that is really one-sided. So those who suffer with anxiety tend to be reclusive, less active, shy, unwilling to serve in church positions that require building relationships. They avoid eye contact or any contact with people who might ask them to do things. This can appear from the outside as a person who is uninterested in the gospel, unconverted or uncommitted to the cause of Zion, and less active, when that is actually far from the truth. They desire to be involved, but really cannot do so in normal ways. Because of their illness, and more often because the illness is very misunderstood, individuals with solid testimonies of the church, its doctrine, and the Savior are left to the side of the road or ignored in many cases. What is so tough is that they have great desires to be involved, but do not have the capacity to accomplish the work as the world of gospel membership requires because of the limitations of the illness. When others do not reach out, the suffering person can appear very disinterested, very distant and indifferent, and not outwardly desirous to be part of the ward community and culture. Now, this outward appearance is actually a masking defense mechanism developed to reduce the levels of anxiety in their life. Now, you will find that someone who suffers with anxiety has developed a host of masking and personal defense mechanisms to allow them to function with the illness. Most of these mechanisms from the outside appear as actions of indifference or non-committal, while the actual truth is entirely the opposite. Now, in looking for solutions to anxiety disorders within church membership, one of the main problems is that only about half of the affected 20% is really ever diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, whether by a doctor or by personal research. And if you will remember my definition, even fewer seek treatment due to the existing stigmas and disinformation of various sorts surrounding depression and anxiety. Less than 50% of those who suffer and need treatment will actually seek it out, and then even a reduced amount of individuals will stick with a treatment plan of action. So you really have a significant group of people who suffer within the church, stuck in really a no man's land between an anxiety disorder and the realities of living and working in a very social church. This group tends to be less active, reclusive, non-committal, and passed over because of the way that the illness manifests its symptoms and their own coping mechanisms. Many even do not know what is causing their problems, and so instead of the church being a place of refuge and peace, it becomes a difficult problem without any real resolution. Almost every person faced with this type of challenge in their life will remove the object causing the added stress, and unfortunately, that is generally the church and its people. This is true even when the church membership is welcoming, loving, and concerned for their welfare. Now, what then are the solutions to an anxiety disorder and a church that can cause really serious stress to that disorder? The first is always a diagnosis from some type of professional. This requires someone from the outside who is trusted by the afflicted person to see the signs of anxiety disorder and suggest and help the person seek professionals that can help them. More often, anxiety disorder within the church comes to light through callings, such as missionary service or other types of church service. A missionary call can be especially problematic for someone who does not know that they have an anxiety-related illness. The illness may not show up until they have been in the field for a period of time. And because they have naturally built defense mechanisms at home and do not feel the anxiety at the same level within the home environment, the sudden onset of anxiety can be bewildering, confusing, embarrassing, and totally defeating to a person. Not only can they somehow not control these newly elevated anxious feelings of fear and dread, but blessings and prayers just do not seem to allow it to dissipate. Then added to the feelings of anxiousness in the field is the thought of returning home, without a good explanation that most people will understand. Missionary callings and service and returning home due to an anxiety disorder can be very lonely, defeating, and terribly embarrassing feeling to a missionary who does not fully understand themselves what is happening. It can seriously affect a person's entire spiritual pathway in life, basically stunting spiritual and natural emotional growth for long periods of time. Now, the same can be true actually for almost any calling in the church and the onset of an anxiety disorder. The called person is likely to say yes to the calling to avoid the appearance and stress associated with saying no. We have that culture in the church that you don't say no to a calling. However, they will very likely be unsuccessful in the calling due to the increased anxiousness and inability to reach out to others whom they do not know. The key to all of the difficulties is really a diagnosis, and then helping the person to understand the nature of the illness and why they are having such difficulties, and most of all, that it isn't their fault. I cannot reiterate that statement enough. Anxiety disorders are an illness, and having one is not a matter of a lack of faith, a lack of diligence, love, or desire. It is simply an illness that needs treatment. These people who suffer need to fully understand that it is an illness that possesses symptoms and problems that, when addressed, will allow them to function more normally in society and more especially in church society. Now, once a person has a diagnosis and begins to fully understand the concerns with the illness, then comes that treatment part of the illness. Treatment is very individual and depends entirely upon the nature and intensity of the illness. Treatment can be difficult in that anxiety disorders simply are not easily treated. More often than not, it's going to require both medication and counseling for someone to really begin to feel more normal in their life. They will also have to begin to face the difficult task of adjusting to and facing their fears and anxieties with help and support from family and friends. Family and friends cannot be the weak at heart or the easily give up type of people. Individuals who suffer with anxiety and who have suffered have already built aversion coping mechanisms over time that will need to be addressed, and most of these methods involve avoidance of the required task. They will be good at making excuses, finding other tasks to occupy the time, and really avoiding the increased anxiety by diversionary tactics. So having someone beside them to encourage and aid them in facing fearful situations is actually incredibly important. Now, how do I know all of this? Anxiety disorder has always been a significant part of my life, and I have learned to live with it and to work daily to overcome many of the issues we've discussed. Currently, my anxieties are milder and under control, but I can still feel a moderate anxiety from time to time. What have I done to overcome the disorder? I have and continue to take medications. I have employed various types of medications, pharmaceuticals, naturopathic therapies, CBD, and really almost every type of remedy that the church membership allows. I've continued to work through my fears, giving hundreds to thousands of presentations at work, at schools, talks, and lessons at church, and other types of public presentations to overcome that fear. I still have mild anxiety, but I have learned to better control it and at times actually use it to my advantage. But it has taken decades of work and failures for me to even come to the point I am. I still have anxiety about many things, including singing in public, acting or drama, really any type of public performance. Even with all of the phone calls I have made throughout my career and continue to make, I still struggle with calling someone on the phone. I struggle with developing good relationships. I struggle with new places, new people, new experiences. I tend to be a person who likes to be home and being outside of groups of people. I don't actively look for places to socialize and tend to be quiet. I tend to overanalyze everything in my life and have to continue to work to put my past in the past and see events for what they really are and avoid the continuous spiral of negative thoughts. Most people who know me would never guess those things about me because I've become very good at masking and making myself work to overcome my anxieties. To function with moderate to severe anxiety for most people will take some type of medication and therapy of some sort. Now, the therapy does not have to be a professional counselor, but I recommend it. Now, the therapy will really be focused on working through spiraling thought patterns, keeping the past in the past, and facing fears one at a time and in measured quantities. The person will also need an advocate to help them keep working through their concerns. Sometimes that will mean tough love, and other times that will mean knowing when to pull back. There is no easy button or answer to the concerns of anxiety as a mental illness. That is especially true for church members. But like most mental illnesses, knowing that you have the illness is half the battle. The other half is work and faith and trust that the Lord will help you through it one step at a time. You're going to have to accept that working through fears and anxiety is going to take time, and it's going to take failures, from which you will have to rise and try again. Today, what I would want most of all for individuals who suffer to know is that there are many people who suffer as you do within the boundaries of the church, and that the Lord fully understands your capacities and your abilities, and perhaps the lack thereof, and accepts you for who you are with the illness. This doesn't mean you don't have to work to overcome them, but what it means is that His grace will be sufficient for you if you do your part. Until next week.